The dusty train platform in Cedar Falls seemed to mock Cordelia Whitmore as she clutched her worn leather satchel, her weathered hands trembling slightly in the autumn breeze. At 65, with silver streaks threading through her once golden hair and lines mapping stories across her face, she knew she was far from what most men expected in a mail-order bride. But desperation had a way of making even the most unlikely dreams seem possible. The advertisement in the Denver Post had been brief but promising. Widowed rancher seeks companionate marriage. Age less important than character. Serious inquiries. Only she had written 3 drafts of her response letter, each one more honest than the last, finally settling on partial truth, mentioning her age as mature and her experience as extensive in household management. The photograph she'd sent had been taken 15 years ago, back when her husband Robert was still alive, and laughter came easier. Now, standing on the platform with her single trunk and fading hope, Cordelia wondered if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. The other passengers had long since been claimed by family or friends, leaving her alone with the station master, who kept glancing at her with barely concealed pity. "Ma'am," the elderly station master approached hesitantly, his cap in his hands. "You sure someone's coming for you? Train's been here near an hour now." Before she could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A weathered man in his 50s rode up on a chestnut mare, his face hard as granite and his eyes cold as winter morning. This had to be Samuel Brennan, her intended husband, though his expression suggested he was having second thoughts. He dismounted slowly, his spurs jingling against the wooden platform as he approached. His gaze swept over her from head to toe, and she watched his face harden with each passing second. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap. "You must be Samuel," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm Cordelia Whitmore." "I can see that," he replied, his tone flat and emotionless. His eyes lingered on her graying hair, the lines around her eyes, the way her traveling dress hung loose on her diminished frame. "Though I have to say, Mrs. Whitmore, your photograph was rather generous." The words hit her like a physical blow, but she lifted her chin with dignity earned through decades of hardship. "I never claimed to be young, Mr. Brennan. My letter stated clearly that I was a mature woman seeking companionship, not romance." "Mature," he repeated, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "I was expecting mature, not ancient. Good Lord, woman, you're old enough to be my mother." The station master cleared his throat uncomfortably, but neither of them paid him any mind. Cordelia felt heat rise in her cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. "I'm 65, Mr. Brennan, not dead. I can cook, clean, manage a household, and work harder than women half my age. If that's not what you're looking for, then perhaps we're both wasting our time." Samuel studied her for a long moment, his jaw working as if chewing over harsh words. Finally, he shook his head with resignation. "Look, Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sure you're a fine woman, but this isn't going to work. I need a wife who can bear children, help with the ranch work, someone who—" He gestured vaguely at her appearance. "Someone with more years ahead than behind." The rejection stung more than she'd expected. 3 months of correspondence, of hope building slowly in her chest, of imagining a new life on the frontier. All crumbling like autumn leaves. But Cordelia Whitmore hadn't survived 65 years by giving up at the first sign of trouble. "I see," she said quietly, bending to pick up her satchel. "Then, I suppose, I'll be taking the next train back to Denver." "Now hold on," the station master interjected, his weathered face creased with concern. "Next eastbound train doesn't come through for 3 days. Where are you planning to stay till then?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Cedar Falls was hardly a bustling metropolis, one hotel, one boarding house, and both likely beyond her diminishing funds. She had spent nearly everything she had on the train ticket west, gambling her future on a dream that had just died on a dusty platform. Samuel seemed to realize the predicament he'd created. His jaw tightened as he looked from Cordelia to the station master and back again. "There's a boarding house on Main Street," he said reluctantly. "Mrs. Patterson runs it. Tell her I sent you. She'll give you a fair rate." "That's very kind," Cordelia replied, though her tone suggested it was anything but. "I'll manage just fine, Mr. Brennan. I always have." As she turned to leave, her trunk proving heavier than expected after the long journey, Samuel called after her, "Mrs. Whitmore." She paused but didn't turn around. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry things didn't work out. You seem like a decent woman." "Decent," she repeated without looking back. "How fortunate." The walk to town was longer than expected, her trunk growing heavier with each step. Main Street stretched before her like a dusty promise, lined with false-fronted buildings that had seen better days. The boarding house stood at the far end, a two-story structure with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch. Mrs. Patterson, a stout woman with suspicious eyes and thinning hair, looked Cordelia up and down much the same. "Way Samuel had. You're the mail-order bride that got turned away," she said bluntly. "Word travels fast in a small town." "I'm a woman in need of lodging for 3 days," Cordelia corrected firmly. "Mr. Brennan said you'd give me a fair rate." "Did he now?" Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose. "That's $2 a night, meals extra, payment in advance." $6 was nearly half of what Cordelia had left, but she had little choice. She counted out the coins with steady hands, though her heart was racing. 3 days to figure out. What came next? How to rebuild a life that seemed to be crumbling faster than she could hold the pieces together. Her room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand that had seen decades of use. Through the single window, she could see the mountains in the distance, purple-hazed and eternal. For the first time since stepping off the train, she allowed herself to sit on the bed and truly feel the weight of her situation. At 65, she was essentially homeless. Her late husband's debts had taken everything, the house, the furniture, even her mother's wedding ring. The small inheritance from her aunt had paid for this journey and little else. She had no children, no family to turn to, no prospects beyond. What she could create with her own 2 hands. A knock at the door interrupted her dark thoughts. Mrs. Patterson stood in the hallway with a young man beside her, tall and lean with kind eyes and work-worn hands. "This here's my nephew, Marcus," Mrs. Patterson said gruffly. "He heard tell of your situation and wanted to meet you proper. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow I have a special story for you." Marcus Patterson stepped into the doorway with the quiet confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. Unlike his aunt's suspicious scrutiny or Samuel's harsh dismissal, his gaze held something Cordelia hadn't seen in years: genuine respect. He couldn't have been more than 30, with sun-weathered hands that spoke of honest work and eyes the color of summer sky. "Ma'am," he said, removing his worn hat to reveal dark hair that needed cutting. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I wanted to apologize for how you've been treated today. Cedar Falls folks are usually more hospitable than what you've experienced." Mrs. Patterson snorted. "Marcus runs the general store down the street. Got some fool notion about helping every stray that wanders into town?" "Everyone deserves kindness, Aunt Vera," Marcus replied mildly, though his jaw tightened slightly. "Especially someone who's traveled so far from home." He turned back to Cordelia. "I heard tell you might be looking for work while you're in town. If you're interested, I could use help in the store. My clerk took sick last week, and I'm drowning in inventory and correspondence." Cordelia studied the young man's face, searching for pity or mockery, but finding neither. "Still, pride made her hesitate. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Patterson, but I wouldn't want charity." "Wouldn't be charity, ma'am. Be honest work for honest pay. $1 a day, and you'd be doing me the favor." His smile was genuine, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "I've got ledgers that haven't been balanced in weeks and customers getting mighty impatient about special orders." The offer was a lifeline she desperately needed, though accepting help from a stranger, especially one young enough to be her son, rankled against everything she'd been taught about self-reliance. But with less than $10 to her name and no clear path forward, pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Very well," she said finally. "When would you need me to start?" "Tomorrow morning, if that suits you. Store opens at 7. Marcus replaced his hat, nodding respectfully. "Welcome to Cedar Falls, Mrs. Whitmore. I hope your stay here proves more pleasant than your arrival." After he left, Mrs. Patterson lingered in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "That boy's got too soft a heart," she muttered, "always picking up strays and broken things, thinking he can fix the world." "I'm neither stray nor broken," Cordelia replied quietly, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. "No?" Mrs. Patterson's laugh was sharp as winter wind. "Then what would you call a woman your age, traveling alone to marry a stranger? What would you call someone with nowhere to go and no one to turn to?" The truth of those words hit deeper than Samuel's rejection had. Cordelia turned back to the window, watching the sun sink behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of loss and regret. "I'd call her someone who's still trying," she whispered. The next morning arrived grey and cold, with the promise of winter riding on the autumn wind. Cordelia dressed carefully in her best day dress, a deep blue wool that had seen better years but still held its shape. Her reflection in the cracked mirror showed every one of her 65 years, the silver threading through her brown hair, the lines around her eyes, the way her shoulders had begun to curve inward, as if protecting her heart from further blows. Patterson's General Store occupied a corner building on Main Street, its windows displaying everything from bolts of cloth to agricultural tools. A bell chimed as she entered, and she was immediately struck by the organized chaos within. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with goods that seemed to have no particular system of arrangement. The smell of coffee, leather, and something indefinably masculine, probably tobacco, filled the air. Marcus emerged from behind the counter, already dressed for work, despite the early hour. "Morning, Mrs. Whitmore. Coffee's fresh, if you'd like. Some before we start." "That would be welcome, thank you." She accepted the steaming mug gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. It had been months since she'd tasted coffee this good, another small luxury sacrificed to mounting debts. "I'll be honest," Marcus said, gesturing toward a desk piled high with papers and ledgers. "The previous clerk wasn't much for organization. Mrs. Henderson ordered fabric 3 weeks ago for her daughter's wedding dress, and I can't find hide nor hair of the order. Meanwhile, I've got shipments coming in with no record of what was ordered or by whom." Cordelia surveyed the chaos with the practiced eye of someone who'd managed a household for over 40 years. "May I?" She approached the desk, her fingers already itching to sort and organize. "Be my guest. I'll tend the front counter while you work your magic." For the first time in months, Cordelia felt useful. Her hands moved efficiently through the papers, creating piles for orders, invoices, correspondence, and receipts. Within an hour, she'd discovered not only Mrs. Henderson's fabric order, but 3 other missing items that customers had been asking about. "How did you do that?" Marcus asked during a brief lull in customers. "Organization is like cooking," Cordelia replied, not looking up from the ledger she was balancing. "Once you understand the basic principles, it's just a matter of following the recipe. And you were a good cook, I take it?" The question was innocent enough, but it opened a door to memories she'd been trying to keep closed. "My husband always said so. Robert loved my pot roast and apple pie. Her voice caught slightly on her late husband's name. He used to joke that he married me for my cooking and stayed for my bookkeeping. Sounds like a smart man. He was. Cordelia's pen stilled on the page. Too smart to die at 58 from a heart that just gave out one Tuesday morning. Too smart to leave his wife with debts that took everything we'd built together. The admission hung in the air between them, more honest than she'd intended. To be with a virtual stranger. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and she wondered if she'd made him uncomfortable with her candor. "My wife died in childbirth," he said finally, his voice so soft she had to strain to hear it. 3 years ago. The baby, too. Some losses. They change the shape of your whole life, don't they?" Cordelia looked up from the ledger, seeing him clearly for the first time. The kindness in his eyes wasn't just natural generosity. It was the hard-won compassion of someone who'd walked through his own valley of shadows. "They do," she agreed quietly. "Sometimes I think grief is just love with nowhere to go." The morning passed quickly after that, with customers coming and going in steady streams. Cordelia found herself falling into an easy rhythm, greeting familiar faces, helping locate items, managing the complex web of credit accounts that seemed to keep half the town afloat. By noon, she'd not only organized the desk, but had identified several discrepancies in the books that would save Marcus considerable money. "You're worth twice what I'm paying you," Marcus said over the simple lunch they shared in the back room. "Flattery, Mr. Patterson." Despite herself, Cordelia felt a smile tugging at her lips. "At my age?" "Truth, Mrs. Whitmore. At any age." His expression grew serious. "I know you're planning to leave in a few days, but I'd like to make you a proposition." Before he could continue, the store's bell chimed violently, followed by heavy footsteps and the jingle of spurs. Samuel Brennan stood in the doorway, his face dark, with what looked like barely contained anger. Behind him stood another man, younger, cleaner, with the soft look of someone who'd never done a day's manual labor. "Patterson," Samuel's voice was tight, "we need to talk." The tension in the store was thick enough to cut with a knife. Samuel's companion, a man in his 30s with pale hands and expensive clothes that marked him as an outsider, stepped forward with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Mr. Patterson, I presume." The stranger extended a manicured hand. "Theodore Ashworth, from the Colorado Territory Development Company. I understand you've been experiencing some staffing challenges." Marcus ignored the offered handshake, his attention fixed on Samuel. "What's this about, Sam?" "Tell him, Ashworth," Samuel growled, his eyes darting nervously between Marcus and Cordelia. Ashworth's smile widened, predatory as a wolf's. "We've been conducting business assessments throughout the territory, identifying properties with untapped potential. Your establishment, Mr. Patterson, sits on land that would be perfect for railroad expansion. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer." "My store's not for sale," Marcus replied flatly. "Everything's for sale, young man. It's simply a matter of price." Ashworth pulled out a leather portfolio, extracting official-looking documents. "We're offering 3 times the assessed value of your property. That's more money than you'd see in 10 years of selling dry goods to farmers." Cordelia watched the exchange with growing unease. She'd seen men like Ashworth before, smooth-talking predators who descended on struggling communities like vultures. The way Samuel avoided eye contact told her there was more to this story than a simple business proposition. "And if I refuse?" Marcus asked. Ashworth's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Well, that would be unfortunate. You see, we've already purchased several key properties in the area. Mr. Brennan here, for instance, has agreed to sell his ranch." "Sam!" Marcus turned to the older man, disbelief clear in his voice. "The Brennan spread's been in your family for 30 years. Samuel's jaw worked like he was chewing bitter medicine. "Times are hard, Marcus. Cattle prices are down, and I've..." Got debts piling up, Ashworth's offer? It's enough to start over somewhere else. Or to pay off gambling debts in Denver, Cordelia said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. All eyes turned to her, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. But having spoken, she couldn't back down now. Forgive me, but I've seen that look before. My husband had it near the end, when the bills were piling up and pride was all that stood between us and ruin. Samuel's face flushed red. You don't know anything about my situation, woman. I know desperation when I see it, Cordelia replied calmly, and I know the kind of men who prey on it. She fixed Ashworth with a steady gaze. What railroad company, Mr. Ashworth? Which line is planning to run track through Cedar Falls? For the first time, Ashworth's composure slipped slightly. That's confidential business information. Is it? Cordelia moved closer to the documents he'd spread on the counter. Years of managing household accounts had taught her to read contracts quickly, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Because, according to these papers, there's no railroad company involved at all. This is a mining claim for silver extraction. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stepped up beside Cordelia, scanning the documents with growing alarm. Silver mining? Sam, you know what that means for the water supply, for the grazing land? It means profit, Ashworth interjected smoothly, but his voice had lost its oily charm. Legitimate profit for everyone involved. Legitimate, Cordelia laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. Mr. Ashworth, I may be an old woman, but I'm not a fool. These contracts are designed to transfer ownership for pennies on the dollar. Once the railroad project fails to materialize, you're not buying land for development, you're stealing it. Ashworth's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the shark beneath. Careful, madam. Accusations like that could be considered slander. Truth isn't slander, Marcus said, his voice deadly quiet. Get out of my store. Now, Mr. Patterson, let's not be hasty. Out. Now. Marcus's hand rested casually on the shotgun behind the counter, but his meaning was clear. Ashworth gathered, his papers with forced calm, but his eyes promised retribution. You're making a mistake, Patterson, both of you. Cedar Falls is changing whether you like it or not. Those who adapt will prosper. Those who don't. He shrugged eloquently. After the two men left, the store felt empty despite the afternoon. Customers who continued to browse the aisles. Marcus was quiet, his face troubled as he processed what had just happened. I'm sorry, Cordelia said finally. I shouldn't have interfered. It's not my place to— You saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life, Marcus interrupted. If you hadn't spotted what those contracts really were. He ran a hand through his hair. Sam must be desperate to even consider dealing with men like that. Desperate men make dangerous choices, Cordelia observed. The question is, what happens now? Men like Ashworth don't give up easily. As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses filled the street outside. Through the window they could see Samuel returning, but this time he wasn't alone. 3 rough-looking men accompanied him, their hands resting meaningfully on gun belts. Marcus, Samuel called from the boardwalk, his voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. Come out here. We need to settle this neighborly-like. Marcus reached for the shotgun, but Cordelia's hand covered his. Wait, she whispered urgently. Something's not right. Samuel's not the type for gunplay. He's being coerced. Sure enough, as they watched through the window, one of the armed men leaned close to Samuel, whispering something that made the rancher's face go pale. Samuel's shoulders sagged as if carrying an invisible weight. They have something on him, Cordelia realized. Or someone. The standoff stretched taut as piano wire, with the whole town seeming to hold its breath. Other shopkeepers had emerged, and from their establishments, drawn by the commotion, but keeping their distance. Mrs. Patterson appeared across the street, her usual stern expression replaced by naked worry. Last chance, Patterson, one of the gunmen called. Mr. Ashworth's patience is wearing thin. Marcus stepped toward the door, but Cordelia moved to block his path. For a moment their eyes met, and she saw something that made her heart stutter unexpectedly. Not just gratitude, but something deeper, warmer, more dangerous. "There's another way," she said softly, an idea forming that was either brilliant or completely insane. "But you'll have to trust me." "What are you thinking?" Cordelia squared her shoulders, feeling more alive than she had in months. "I'm thinking it's time these men learned that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one they never see coming." Before Marcus could protest, she walked to the door and stepped out onto the boardwalk, her hands empty and her chin raised. "Hi!" The gunman tensed, clearly not expecting an elderly woman to complicate their carefully planned intimidation. "Gentlemen," she called in a voice that carried down the street, "I believe you're looking for me." The three gunmen exchanged confused glances, clearly thrown by Cordelia's unexpected appearance. The leader, a lean man with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, squinted at her with undisguised suspicion. "Mum, you best get back inside," he drawled, his hand still resting on his gun butt. "This ain't no concern of yours." "Oh, but it is," Cordelia replied, stepping fully onto the boardwalk despite the danger. The autumn wind caught her skirts, and she could smell the scent of approaching rain mixed with dust and horse sweat. "You see, gentlemen, I believe there's been a terrible misunderstanding." Behind her, she heard Marcus's sharp intake of breath, but she pressed on. Years of managing a household had taught her that sometimes the best defense was a bold offense. "Mr. Ashworth hired you to encourage Mr. Patterson to sell his property, am I correct?" She addressed the scarred man directly, ignoring the way his companions were fingering their weapons. But what he failed to mention is that the property isn't actually for sale because it's already been purchased. Samuel stepped forward, his weathered face creased with confusion. "What in tarnation are you talking about, woman?" Cordelia smiled serenely, praying her gamble would work. "Why, Samuel, surely you remember. The marriage contract you signed with me specifically included property rights. As your intended wife, I'm entitled to a full accounting of all real estate transactions involving your assets." The lie rolled off her tongue smoother than honey, but she could see it hitting its mark. The gunmen looked uncertain now, caught. Between their orders and the possibility of legal complications they weren't prepared to handle. "Now see here," the scarred man began, but Cordelia cut him off with the imperious tone she'd once used to manage unruly church committees. "Furthermore," she continued, pulling a folded paper from her reticule, actually her train ticket, but they wouldn't know that at this distance, "I have documentation proving that any business conducted in Cedar Falls without proper notification to all invested parties is null and void under territorial law." The bluff was outrageous, but it was working. The gunmen were clearly out of their depth when it came to legal maneuvering, and Samuel looked like a man watching his carefully constructed house of cards begin to wobble. "You're talking nonsense," Samuel protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "We ain't married, never was going to be married after I seen you proper." "Ah, but you signed the preliminary agreement," Cordelia pressed, warming to her performance. "And according to Territorial Statute 247B, any contractual negotiation involving a promised spouse creates temporary joint custody of assets pending final resolution." There was no such statute, of course, but the words sounded official enough to give the gunman pause. The scarred man was looking increasingly uncomfortable, clearly realizing this simple intimidation job was becoming complicated. "Boss ain't gonna like this," one of his companions muttered. "Boss can take it up with the territorial judge," Cordelia replied briskly. "Now I suggest you gentlemen return to Mr. Ashworth and inform him that Cedar Falls will not be bullied by outsiders who think they can steal from hard-working folk." For a moment the tension hung in the air like smoke from a cooking fire. Then incredibly, the scarred man touched his hat brim in a grudging gesture of respect. "Ma'am," he said simply, then jerked his head toward his companions. "Boys, let's go report to the boss." As they mounted their horses and rode away, Cordelia felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was fading, leaving her shaky and uncertain. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Samuel breathed, staring after the departing riders. "Where in hell did you learn to talk like that?" 43 years of marriage to a man who couldn't balance a checkbook if his life depended on it, Cordelia replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "You learn to sound confident even when you're making it up as you go along." Marcus appeared at her elbow, his face pale but admiring. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever witnessed." "Probably both," Cordelia admitted, accepting his steadying hand as reaction set in, "though I suspect we've only bought ourselves time, not solved the problem." Samuel removed his hat, running his fingers through his graying hair. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Whitmore. Hell, I owe you more than that. If you hadn't seen through those contracts—" "What I saw," Cordelia said carefully, "was a man in trouble who didn't know where else to turn. The question now is whether you're ready to fight back, or if you're still planning to run." The rancher's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she'd met him, Cordelia saw the steel beneath his weathered exterior. "Running's what got me into this mess in the first place. After Martha died last spring, I let things slide, didn't keep up with the books, didn't pay attention to who was lending money and at what terms." He met her eyes directly. "Ashworth's men made it clear that if I didn't cooperate, they'd make sure certain debts got called in all at once." "How much do you owe?" Marcus asked quietly. "Near $800, spread between 3 different lenders in Denver." Samuel's voice was heavy with shame. "Borrowed against next year's cattle prices, figured I could make it work somehow. $800 might as well have been 8,000 for a small rancher already struggling with poor cattle prices." Cordelia felt a familiar pang of recognition. The crushing weight of debt that could destroy a life's work in a matter of months. "There might be another way," she said slowly, an idea beginning to form. "But it would require trust from both of you, and probably half the town besides." Before either man could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats filled the street again. This time, it was Ashworth himself, accompanied by a different set of hired guns, these ones looking considerably more professional and dangerous than the first group. Well, Ashworth called as he dismounted, his earlier jovial mask completely gone. "Mrs. Whitmore, isn't it? I hear you've been spreading lies about my business practices." "I've been sharing facts about fraudulent contracts," Cordelia replied evenly, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "There's a difference." Ashworth smiled, but it was the cold expression of a snake preparing to strike. "Facts can. It does be interpreted in many ways. For instance, it's a fact that Mr. Brennan owes considerable money to some very impatient creditors. It's also a fact that accidents happen on ranches, cattle stampede, barn fires, that sort of thing." The threat was clear, and Samuel's face went white. "You leave my livestock alone, Ashworth. That depends entirely on how cooperative you choose to be." Ashworth's gaze shifted to Marcus. "And you, Mr. Patterson, I hear you're harboring a troublemaker. Perhaps it's time you reconsidered your staffing decisions." "Mrs. Whitmore works for me as long as she chooses to," Marcus replied firmly, "and my store stays in my family where it belongs." "Loyalty is admirable," Ashworth mused, pulling out a pocket watch and checking the time. "But expensive. I'll give you until tomorrow morning to reconsider. After that—" He shrugged eloquently. As he prepared to leave, Cordelia stepped forward once more. "Mr. Ashworth, before you go, might I ask you a question?" He paused, clearly curious despite himself. "Certainly. What makes you think the people of Cedar Falls will stand by and let you steal their town?" Ashworth's laugh was genuinely amused. "My dear woman, what makes you think they have a choice?" As Ashworth and his hired guns rode away, leaving dust clouds and implied threats in their wake, the three stood in silence on the boardwalk. Around them, the town seemed to exhale collectively, but Cordelia could sense the fear that hung in the air like morning fog. "Tomorrow morning," Samuel said finally, his voice hollow. "That ain't much time to figure a way out of this mess." "It's enough," Cordelia replied, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it herself. "But we'll need help, and that means telling people the truth about what's really happening here." Marcus nodded toward the other businesses along Main Street. "Most folks have been keeping their heads down, hoping this whole thing passes them by. They don't realize Ashworth won't stop with just a few properties." "Then we'll have to make them understand," Cordelia said firmly. She turned to Samuel. "How many other ranchers are in similar situations? Debt problems, pressure to sell?" Samuel's weathered face creased with thought. "Johnson's been struggling since his wife took sick. Medical bills piled up something fierce. The Kawamoto family's been behind on their mortgage since the drought hit their crops. And old Pete Morrison's been talking about selling out and moving to California. All potential targets," Marcus observed grimly. "Ashworth's been working this territory for a while, hasn't he?" "Longer than any of us realized," Cordelia agreed. She could see the pattern now. The systematic targeting of vulnerable properties, the manufactured crises that forced desperate sales. It was a strategy she'd seen before. During the financial panics back east, Mrs. Patterson appeared at Cordelia's elbow, having crossed the street during their conversation. "That was some fancy talking you did there, girl," the older woman said, grudgingly, "though I hope you know what you've gotten yourself into." "I know exactly what I've gotten into," Cordelia replied. "The question is whether the rest of this town has the backbone to stand up for itself." "Fighting words from someone who's been here all of 2 days," Mrs. Patterson observed, but there was respect in her voice now rather than suspicion. "Sometimes it takes an outsider to see what's really happening," Cordelia said. "Inside voices get used to accepting things they shouldn't have to accept." The bell in the church tower began to toll the hour, 4 o'clock, which meant there were only a few hours of daylight left to organize whatever resistance they could muster. Cordelia felt the familiar sensation of time running out, the same feeling she'd lived with during her husband's final illness, when every decision seemed to carry impossible weight. "There's going to be a town meeting tonight," she announced, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. 7 o'clock, in the church. Everyone needs to know what they're really facing. "And who's going to call this meeting?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "You ain't exactly what you'd call a leading citizen around here." "I'll call it," Marcus said quietly. "The Patterson family's been part of this community for 20 years. People will listen. Will they come, though?" Samuel asked. "Once word gets around about what happened here today, folks might be too scared to get involved." "They'll come," Cordelia said with more confidence than she felt. "Because deep down, everyone knows that if we don't stand together, we'll all fall separately. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe." Now back to the story. As the afternoon wore on, word of the proposed meeting spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire. Some responded with enthusiasm, others with fear, but everyone was talking. Cordelia spent the remaining daylight hours moving, from business to business, listening to concerns and gathering information about Ashworth's other activities in the area. What she learned was worse than she'd expected. The mining company had already purchased options on water rights upstream from the town. They'd bought the mineral rights to several key properties through shell companies, and they'd been quietly foreclosing on small loans throughout the territory, always just before the borrowers could make payments. "It's a carefully planned operation," she explained to Marcus as they prepared for the evening meeting. "They're not just after individual properties, they want to control the entire valley." For silver mining? Marcus asked, checking the oil. In the church lamps. That's just the beginning, Cordelia replied grimly. Control the water, control the land, control the transportation routes, and you control everything that happens here for the next 50 years. By 7 o'clock, the small church was packed beyond capacity. Farmers, shopkeepers, and their families filled every pew, with additional folks standing along the walls. Cordelia was surprised to see faces she didn't recognize, people who'd ridden in from surrounding ranches and settlements, drawn by word of what was happening in Cedar Falls. Marcus stood at the front of the church, his usually calm demeanor showing signs of strain. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the crowded space. "I know some of you took risks just being here tonight." A murmur ran through the crowd at this acknowledgement of the danger they all faced. "Most of you know Mrs. Cordelia Whitmore," Marcus continued, gesturing toward where she sat in the front pew. "She's only been in town for 2 days, but she's already seen through the lies that some of us have been accepting for too long." Cordelia rose, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. Public speaking had never been her strength, but desperate times called for courage she didn't know she possessed. "Friends," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I came to Cedar Falls as a mail-order bride who got rejected for being too old. I was planning to leave tomorrow, defeated and with nowhere to go." A few sympathetic murmurs rippled through the crowd, "But sometimes," she continued, "life puts you exactly where you need to be, even when it doesn't seem like it at the time. And right now, Cedar Falls needs people who understand what it means to fight for something worth keeping." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled faces, weathered ranchers, tired shopkeepers, worried mothers holding sleeping children. "Mr. Ashworth and his associates want you to believe you have no choice but to sell your properties, your businesses, your heritage to them. They want you to believe that resistance is futile, that you're too small and too isolated to matter." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, fed by a righteous anger that had been building since her arrival. "But I've seen what happens when good people stand together. I've seen communities survive drought, financial panic, and worse by refusing to give up on each other. And I see that same strength in this room tonight." Old Pete Morrison, the rancher, who'd been considering selling out, stood up slowly. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but what exactly are you proposing we do? Ashworth's got money, hired guns, and legal papers. We've got—" He gestured around the church. "This. We have something he doesn't," Cordelia replied firmly. "We have each other, and we have the truth." She reached into her reticule and pulled out the contracts she'd examined earlier, spreading them on the pulpit for all to see. "These documents prove that Ashworth's entire operation is built on fraud. The railroad he's promising, it doesn't exist. The mining rights he claims to have, they're based on forged surveys. The legal authority he's been using to pressure you, it's all lies." The crowd erupted in angry voices, but Cordelia raised her hand for silence. "But here's what he doesn't know," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, forcing everyone to lean forward to hear. "He doesn't know that tomorrow morning, when he comes back expecting our surrender, he's going to find something he never expected." "What's that?" someone called from the back. Cordelia smiled, feeling more alive and purposeful than she had in years. "He's going to find out what happens when you mess with the wrong town." The church fell silent as Cordelia's words hung in the air like gun smoke. She could see doubt warring with hope on the faces before her, weathered ranchers who'd fought drought and debt, shop owners who'd struggled through lean winters, families who'd carved lives from unforgiving soil with nothing but determination and calloused hands. "That's mighty fine talk, ma'am," came a gravelly voice from the back. Jake Morrison, Pete's younger brother, pushed his way forward through the crowd. "But talk don't stop bullets, and Ashworth's got plenty of men with iron on their hips." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathering. Cordelia felt the fragile momentum she'd built beginning to slip away like water through cupped hands. Jake's right, Samuel said reluctantly, his hat twisted between his weathered fingers. I seen those gun hands up close. They ain't the usual. Drifters looking for easy money. These boys got the look of men who've seen the elephant and lived to tell about it. Then we don't fight them with guns, Cordelia replied, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. She'd spoken without thinking, driven by desperation more than wisdom. How else you fight armed men? This from Mrs. Kawamoto, whose family farmed the fertile bottomland east of town. Her English was careful but clear, shaped by years of making. Herself understood in a language not her own. My husband and sons, they work land with hands, not guns. Cordelia looked at the small, determined woman and felt something click into place. A memory from her childhood when her father had faced down a corrupt grain merchant who'd been cheating local farmers. Mrs. Kawamoto's right, she said slowly, the plan crystallizing as she spoke. We can't outgun them, but we don't have to. We just have to make it too expensive for them to stay. Marcus stepped forward, his brow furrowed. What do you mean? I mean, Cordelia said, warming to the idea, that men like Ashworth understand only one thing, profit. Take that away, and they move on to easier prey. She moved to the church's single window, gesturing toward the darkened street beyond. Right. Now Ashworth thinks he's got us cornered. He expects us to fold, to sell out cheap, rather than face his hired guns. But what if we don't give him that choice? Cordelia, Marcus said gently, using her first name for the first time. You're talking in riddles. The sound of her name on his lips sent an unexpected warmth through her chest, but she pushed the feeling aside. There would be time for such thoughts later, if there was a later. Not riddles, she replied. Strategy. My husband used to say that every man's got a weakness. You just have to find the right lever to move him. She turned back to the crowd, seeing faces that had grown skeptical again. These were practical people who dealt in concrete realities, cattle and crops, drought and debt, birth and death. They needed more than hope. They needed a plan. Ashworth's weakness is that he's operating outside the law, she continued. Those contracts he's using, the foreclosures, the intimidation, all of it depends on people being too scared or too isolated to fight back. So what do we do? Asked Tom Henderson, the blacksmith whose massive arms were crossed over his leather apron. Send a strongly worded letter to the territorial governor. Laughter, bitter but genuine, rose from the crowd. No, Cordelia said simply. We make him famous. The laughter died away, replaced by confused silence. Every week, the Denver Post runs stories about territorial development, mining claims, business opportunities, she explained. What do you think they'd say about a mining company that uses forged documents and hired guns to steal land from hard-working families? Understanding began to dawn on several faces, but Pete Morrison shook his grizzled head. Even if you could, get word to Denver, even if they believed you. That takes time we don't have, Ashworth said tomorrow morning. Then we buy time, Cordelia replied. We make tomorrow morning so public, so witnessed, that Ashworth can't afford to use violence. How? The question came from multiple voices at once. Cordelia smiled, feeling more like herself than she had since stepping off the train. We throw a party. The silence that followed was so complete she could hear the wind whistling through the church's loose boards. Then someone, she thought it might have been Jake Morrison, started to chuckle. The laughter spread through the crowd like flame through dry grass, part hysteria and part genuine amusement. A party, Samuel repeated, shaking his head. Lady, you've either got more sand than sense or you're plain loco. Maybe both, Cordelia admitted. But think about it. Tomorrow's Saturday, market day. What if, instead of hiding in our homes waiting for Ashworth to make his threats, we were all out in the street? What if we had visitors from neighboring towns? What if there were so many witnesses that Ashworth couldn't afford to show his true colors? Marcus was nodding slowly, understanding beginning to light his eyes. "A harvest celebration," he said. "We've talked about having one for years." "Exactly. Food, music, games for the children, and plenty of people to see exactly what kind of man Theodore Ashworth really is." "That's assuming he shows up at all," Tom Henderson pointed out. "Man's not stupid. He sees a crowd, he might just wait us out." "He'll show," Cordelia said with certainty. "Men like Ashworth can't resist making a show of power. He'll want everyone to see him force us to surrender." Mrs. Patterson, who'd been silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke up. "And when he does show up with his guns, what then? You think a few fiddles and some apple pie will stop bullets?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Cordelia felt the weight of it, the responsibility of all these lives looking to her for answers. She wasn't sure she had. "I think," she said carefully, "that bullets are Ashworth's last resort, not his first. He needs our signatures on legal documents to make his theft look legitimate. Dead people can't sign papers." "But scared people can," Jake Morrison pointed out grimly. "Yes," Cordelia agreed, "scared people can. But proud people surrounded by their neighbors and friends, that's different." She looked around the crowded church, meeting as many eyes as she could. "I won't lie to you. This is dangerous. Ashworth won't give up easy, and cornered men do desperate things. But the alternative is to let him steal everything you've worked for, everything your children might inherit." A baby's cry broke the silence, quickly hushed by its mother. In that sound, Cordelia heard the future, the next generation that would either inherit a free community or grow up under the thumb of men like Ashworth. "I'm in," Marcus said suddenly, his voice clear and strong. "Whatever happens tomorrow, at least we'll face it together." "And I," said Mrs. Kawamoto, her small frame somehow radiating determination. One by one, others began to nod agreement. Not all, several families slipped out into the night, unwilling to risk what little they had left. But enough stayed, enough committed themselves to the desperate gamble, that Cordelia felt hope beginning to bloom in her chest. "All right then," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. "We've got until dawn to organize the biggest harvest celebration Cedar Falls has ever seen." As the crowd began to disperse, people clustering in small groups to plan and organize, Marcus approached her. In the lamplight, his face looked younger somehow, as if the decision to fight had lifted years from his shoulders. "Cordelia," he said quietly, "what you did tonight, I've never seen anything like it." "I just said what needed saying," she replied, suddenly aware of how close he was standing, of the way the lamplight caught the silver threads in his dark hair. "No," he said seriously, "you gave them hope, gave all of us hope." For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, surrounded by the buzz of planning voices. Then Marcus reached out, gently touching her hand. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "I want you to know that I'm glad you came to Cedar Falls. Rejection or no rejection, you belong here." The words hit her harder than any of Ashworth's threats. After months of feeling lost and unwanted, of believing her best years were behind her, someone was telling her she belonged. "Marcus," she began, but he shook his head. "We'll have time to talk properly after this is over," he said. "Right now, we've got a celebration to plan and a town to save." As they walked out into the cool night air, Cordelia couldn't help but smile. Tomorrow would bring either triumph or disaster. But tonight, for the first time in years, she felt truly alive. Behind them, the church continued to buzz with activity as Cedar Falls prepared for the fight of its life. Dawn broke grey and cold over Cedar Falls, painting the sky in shades that matched Cordelia's nervous stomach. She'd barely slept, spending the night helping with preparations that had continued by lamplight well past midnight. Now, standing at her boarding house window with a cup of weak coffee, she watched the town transform itself. Main Street had been cleared of its usual Saturday morning clutter. Instead of the typical scatter of farm wagons and hitching posts, colourful bunting stretched between buildings like hope made visible. Tables appeared as if by magic, groaning under the weight of pies, preserves, and roasted corn that filled the morning air with the rich scent of community effort. A knock at her door interrupted her surveillance. Mrs. Patterson entered without, waiting for permission, carrying a bundle of dark blue fabric. "Figured you might want something more fitting for today than that traveling dress," the older woman said gruffly, though her eyes held unexpected kindness. "This was my daughter's before she married and moved to California." Cordelia accepted, the dress with trembling fingers. The fabric was simple but well made, cut in a style that would flatter rather than hide her mature figure. "Mrs. Patterson, I can't possibly—" "Course you can. Margaret was about your size, and Lord knows she'd approve of what you're doing today." The boarding housekeeper's voice softened. "Takes courage to stand up for strangers. Takes more courage to stand up for a place that's barely welcomed you. Cedar Falls has welcomed me more than anywhere I've been in years," Cordelia replied honestly. "Sometimes home isn't the place you come from, it's the place that needs you." An hour later, dressed in Margaret Patterson's blue wool and with her silver-streaked hair pinned in a style that emphasized dignity rather than age, Cordelia walked toward Main Street. The transformation was remarkable. What had been a quiet farming town the previous morning now buzzed with the energy of celebration. Children ran between the tables, their laughter mixing with the sound of fiddle music and adult conversation. Families had come from as far as 20 miles away, drawn by hastily spread word of Cedar Falls's first harvest festival. The crowd was exactly what Cordelia had hoped for. Too many witnesses for Ashworth to risk open violence. "You clean up real nice," Marcus said, appearing at her, elbow with 2 cups of cider. He'd traded his usual work clothes for a clean white shirt and his best vest, and Cordelia felt her heart skip unexpectedly at the sight. "Flattery, Mr. Patterson?" she asked, accepting the cider gratefully. "Truth, Mrs. Whitmore." His eyes held, hers for a moment longer than strictly necessary. "How are you feeling about all this?" Before she could answer, a commotion near the edge of town drew their attention. A dust cloud on the horizon was growing larger, and the sound of multiple horses carried clearly on the morning air. "He's coming," Cordelia said unnecessarily. Around them, she could feel the festive atmosphere falter as people noticed the approaching riders. "Remember," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the crowd, "we're here to celebrate our harvest and our community. Everyone just keep doing what you're doing." The advice was easier given than followed. As Ashworth and his men rode into town, conversations grew forced and children moved closer to their parents. But the crowd held, and Cordelia felt a surge of pride at their courage. Ashworth had brought more men this time, 8 riders total, all armed and professional-looking. They reined in at the edge of the celebration, clearly taken aback by the unexpected festivity. "Well," Ashworth called out, his voice carrying clearly over the nervous crowd, "how delightfully rustic. I wasn't aware Cedar Falls was given to spontaneous celebrations." Marcus stepped forward, his posture relaxed but ready. "First annual Harvest Festival, Mr. Ashworth? You're welcome to join us. We've got plenty of food." How generous. Ashworth dismounted, his eyes scanning the crowd with predatory calculation. "Though I believe we had business to conclude this morning." "Business can wait," Cordelia said, moving to stand beside Marcus. "Today's for celebrating what we've built together." Ashworth's gaze fixed on her with undisguised hostility. "Ah, the troublesome Mrs. Whitmore. Still spreading your lies about my perfectly legitimate business practices? I prefer to think of it as sharing truth about your fraudulent contracts," Cordelia replied evenly, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. A murmur ran through the crowd at her bold words. Several families began edging away from the confrontation, but others pressed closer, forming a loose circle around the antagonists. "Careful, madam," Ashworth warned, his veneer of civility beginning to crack. "Slander is a serious charge in territorial courts. So is fraud," came a new voice from the edge of the crowd. Everyone turned to see a man in a dusty black suit dismounting from a lathered horse. He was tall and lean, with the kind of pale complexion that spoke of office work, rather than outdoor labor. In his hand, he carried a leather portfolio that he clutched like a weapon. "And who might you be?" Ashworth demanded, though something in his expression suggested he already knew. "James Morrison, correspondent for the Denver Post," the newcomer replied, pulling out a small notebook. "I received some very interesting information about mining development in this area. Thought it might make for compelling reading." Cordelia felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. She'd sent the letter to Denver 3 days ago, not daring to hope it would arrive in time or be taken seriously. The reporter's presence changed everything. Suddenly, this wasn't just a local dispute, but a potential territorial scandal. Ashworth's face had gone pale beneath his carefully groomed beard. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean. My company's operations are entirely legitimate, are they?" Morrison flipped open his notebook, consulting pages covered in neat handwriting. "Because according to my sources, the Colorado Territory Development Company has been using forged surveys, fraudulent liens, and intimidation tactics to acquire properties throughout the region." Sources. Ashworth's voice had lost its confident tone. "What sources?" Morrison's smile was thin as winter sunlight. "A lady in Denver received some very detailed documentation about your activities, Mr. Ashworth, contracts, correspondence, even testimony from some of your former associates, who've grown, shall we say, concerned about your methods." The reporter's gaze shifted to include Ashworth's hired guns, who were looking increasingly uncomfortable with the unexpected attention. "Gentlemen, I don't suppose any of you would care to comment on your employer's business practices. My readers are always interested in hearing from those who do the actual work." Several of the gunmen exchanged glances, and Cordelia could see doubt creeping into their expressions. Whatever they'd been told about this job, it clearly hadn't included dealing with newspaper reporters and territorial scandals. "This is preposterous," Ashworth blustered, but his earlier confidence had evaporated like morning dew. "I won't stand here and be insulted by some ink-slinging scandal-monger." "Then perhaps you'd prefer to discuss matters with Territorial Marshal Hayes," Morrison replied pleasantly. "He's very interested in meeting with you, Mr. Ashworth. Something about warrants that have been issued in connection with your activities in Colorado Springs." The words hit Ashworth like physical blows. His face went from pale to ashen, and for the first time since Cordelia had met him, he looked genuinely afraid. "Marshal Hayes," Samuel whispered to Marcus. "Thought he was down in Santa Fe on that rustling case." "He was," Morrison confirmed, overhearing, "until reports of organized fraud brought him north. He should be arriving this afternoon with a federal deputy and enough warrants to paper a small room." Ashworth's composure finally cracked completely. "Boys," he snapped to his hired guns, "we're leaving, now!" But the gunmen were already mounting their horses, clearly having decided that whatever they were being paid wasn't worth facing federal marshals and newspaper scandals. Within minutes, the entire group was riding out of town at a pace that suggested urgent business elsewhere. As the dust settled behind the departing riders, the Harvest Festival erupted in genuine celebration. People who had been holding their breath for days finally allowed themselves to believe that the threat was over. "How?" Marcus asked Cordelia quietly as the crowd swirled around them in relief and joy. "How did you manage to get word to Denver so quickly?" Cordelia smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "I may be 65 and rejected as too old for marriage, but I've been managing correspondence for 40 years. I know which letters, get attention and which ones get filed away. And the documentation Morrison mentioned, copies of everything I could get my hands on, plus detailed accounts from everyone I talked to yesterday. She paused, then added softly, plus a few educated guesses about what a man like Ashworth might be hiding in his past. Marcus stared at her with something that looked very much like admiration. Remind me never to underestimate you, Cordelia. Whitmore, the sound of her name on his lips, spoken with such warmth and respect, made her heart flutter in a way she'd thought impossible at her age. But before she could respond, they were surrounded by celebrating townspeople, all wanting to thank the woman who had saved their community. As the afternoon wore on and the festival continued around them, Cordelia allowed herself to feel something she hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of being exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Cedar Falls had found its champion in the most unlikely place, and she had found her home in return. 3 weeks later, Cordelia stood in the doorway of Patterson's General Store, watching the November sun paint Main Street in shades of gold and amber. The morning air carried the sharp scent of coming winter, mixed with the smoke from dozens of chimneys and the comforting aroma of fresh-baked bread from the bakery across the street. The store had become more than just her workplace. It had become the unofficial heart of Cedar Falls recovery. Farmers stopped by not just for supplies, but for advice on dealing with the legal aftermath of Ashworth's schemes. Women came seeking her help with correspondence to territorial officials. Even the children had begun treating her as a permanent fixture, someone who belonged. "You're looking mighty thoughtful this morning," Marcus observed, emerging from the back room with a crate of supplies. The easy familiarity between them had grown over the past weeks, built on shared work and quiet conversations after the store, closed each evening. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Cordelia replied, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. Their fingers brushed as she took the cup, and she felt the same warm flutter she'd been trying to ignore for days. "Changed for the better, I'd say." His smile was gentle but carried an undertone she wasn't quite ready to examine. "Town's got its spirit back, thanks to you." "Thanks to all of us," she corrected, though she couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing Cedar Falls thriving again. The territorial marshal had indeed arrived, armed with warrants that sent Ashworth and his remaining associates fleeing toward Mexico. The fraudulent contracts had been voided, the threatened foreclosures cancelled, and legitimate mining claims restored to their rightful owners. The bell above the door chimed, interrupting her reverie. Samuel Brennan entered, hat in hand, and wearing what looked like his Sunday best, despite it being a Wednesday morning. His weathered face was flushed, either from the cold or from nervousness. "Morning, Samuel," Marcus called. "What brings you to town so early?" Samuel twisted his hat between his hands, his eyes fixed on Cordelia with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Actually, I came to talk to Mrs. Whitmore, if she's got a minute to spare." Cordelia set down her coffee, curious about the rancher's obvious discomfort. Since the confrontation with Ashworth, Samuel had been polite but distant, clearly struggling with embarrassment over his initial rejection of her. "Of course, Mr. Brennan. What can I do for you?" Samuel took a deep breath, like a man preparing to jump into cold water. "Well, ma'am, I've been doing some thinking these past weeks about what happened when you first arrived, about the things I said." "Samuel," Cordelia began gently, "there's no need to—" "Yes, there is," he interrupted, his voice gaining strength. "I was wrong about you, dead wrong, and I've come to make amends if you'll let me." Marcus moved closer, his protective instincts clearly activated by Samuel's intensity. Cordelia could feel the tension building in the small space between the three of them. "What kind of amends?" she asked carefully. Samuel's face reddened further, but he pressed on. The kind that involves a proper proposal. Mrs. Whitmore, I'd be honored if you'd consider becoming my wife." The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a gun barrel. Cordelia felt her breath catch, not from romantic excitement but from the sheer unexpectedness of it. Behind her, she heard Marcus set down something with more force than necessary. "Samuel," she said slowly, "that's very kind of you, but I know what you're thinking," Samuel rushed on. "I know I treated you poorly before, judged you on foolish things like age instead of character, but I've seen what kind of woman you are now. Strong, smart, brave, everything a man could want in a partner." Cordelia was acutely aware of Marcus's presence behind her, of the way his breathing had changed, of the careful stillness that had settled over him. The conversation she'd been avoiding for weeks was suddenly unavoidable. "Mr. Brennan," she began again, "I appreciate the sentiment. Truly I do, but my answer has to be no." Samuel's face fell, but he pressed on with the desperation of a man making a last stand. "Is it because of what happened before? Because I can make that right, Mrs. Whitmore. I can give you a good life, a proper home." "It's not about what happened before," Cordelia said firmly but kindly. "It's about what's happening now. Samuel, you're offering me a practical arrangement based on respect and gratitude. But that's not enough anymore." "What do you mean?" Cordelia turned slightly, her gaze finding Marcus's face. His expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands had clenched into fists at his sides. "I mean," she said softly, "that at 65, I've finally learned the difference between settling for what's offered and waiting for what's right." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding. Samuel's shoulders sagged as comprehension dawned, his eyes moving between Cordelia and Marcus with growing realization. "I see," he said quietly. "Well then, I suppose I've made a fool of myself twice now." "No," Cordelia replied gently. "You've shown courage twice. That's not the same thing at all." Samuel managed a rueful smile as he placed his hat back on his head. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Whitmore, I think you're making the right choice. Marcus is a good man, better than me, that's certain." After Samuel left, the store felt smaller somehow, charged with electricity that had been building for weeks. Marcus busied himself with unnecessary tasks, while Cordelia pretended to focus on the ledgers, both of them dancing around the conversation that Samuel's proposal had made inevitable. "Cordelia," Marcus said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "about what you said to Samuel—" "Marcus," she interrupted, then stopped, unsure how to continue. At 65, she felt as nervous as a schoolgirl, uncertain about feelings she'd thought were behind her forever. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the soap he used for shaving, the familiar scent of coffee and leather that clung to his clothes. "I need to know," he said softly. He said, "These past weeks, the way things have been between us, am I imagining it?" She looked up at him, seeing not just kindness in his eyes, but something deeper, warmer, more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart. "You're not imagining it. Then, why are we both acting like strangers circling around a fire?" His hand lifted, fingertips barely brushing her cheek. "Cordelia, I know the difference in our ages might seem—" "Might seem what?" she asked, covering his hand with hers. "Scandalous, inappropriate. Marcus, I'm too old to care what people think, and too tired to pretend I don't feel what I feel." "And what do you feel?" The question was barely a whisper before she could lose her courage. Cordelia rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and brief, but unmistakably real. When she pulled back, his eyes were wide with surprise, and something that looked very much like joy. "I feel," she said carefully, "like a woman who's been given a second chance at happiness she didn't think she deserved." Marcus's smile started, slow and spread across his face like sunrise. "In that case, Mrs. Whitmore, I have a question for you." "Oh?" How do you feel about staying in Cedar Falls permanently? Because I can't imagine this place without you anymore." Before she could answer, the store's bell chimed again, and Mrs. Patterson entered with her arms full of mail. The older woman took one look at their faces, the way they were standing close together, and smiled with satisfaction. "About time," she declared, setting the mail on the counter. "Town's been taking bets on when you two would finally stop pretending to be just business partners." "Mrs. Patterson." Cordelia felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Don't you Mrs. Patterson me, girl. I've got eyes in my head." The boarding house keeper's expression softened. "Besides, my Marcus deserves someone who sees what a good man he is. And you deserve someone who sees what a remarkable woman you are." As Mrs. Patterson bustled out, leaving them alone again, Marcus took Cordelia's hands in his. "She's right, you know, about deserving happiness." "At my age?" Cordelia asked, old insecurities creeping into her voice. "At any age," Marcus replied firmly. "Cordelia, when I lost my wife and child, I thought my chance for a family was over. But you've shown me that sometimes life gives us unexpected gifts, if we're brave enough to accept them." The words hit her like a physical blow, not of pain, but of overwhelming gratitude. After months of feeling discarded, unwanted, too old for dreams, here was a man telling her she was a gift. "Marcus," she began, but he shook his head. "Let me finish. I love you, Cordelia Whitmore. I love your strength, your courage, your refusal to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. I love the way you see possibilities where others see problems. The way you make everyone around you believe they can be better than they are." Tears she hadn't expected burned behind her eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "More than I thought possible at this stage of my life." "Then marry me," he said simply. "Not for convenience or companionship, but because we've found something rare and precious that deserves to be celebrated." Through the store window, Cordelia could see Main Street bustling with the life of a town that had found its strength again. Cedar Falls had given her more than just refuge from rejection. It had given her purpose, community, and now love she'd never expected to find. "Yes," she said, the word carrying the weight of a future she was finally ready to embrace. "Yes, Marcus Patterson, I'll marry you." Christmas Eve arrived with the kind of crisp, clear cold that made everything in Cedar Falls look like it had been carved from crystal. Snow had fallen steadily for 3 days, transforming the rough frontier town into something from a picture. A book, with icicles hanging from every eave and smoke rising straight up from chimneys in the still air. Inside the small church where Cordelia had first rallied the town against Ashworth, the pews were packed with faces she'd come to know and love over the past 2 months. The same building that had witnessed her desperate speech now glowed with candlelight and the warmth of a community gathered to celebrate not just Christmas, but the wedding of 2 people who'd found love when they'd least expected it. Cordelia stood at the back of the church, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed the skirt of her wedding dress. It wasn't white. At 65, she'd decided cream silk was more appropriate, but it was beautiful, sewn by the combined efforts of every woman in town who'd wanted to contribute something to the celebration. "You look beautiful," Jenny Morrison whispered, adjusting the small spray of winter roses that served as Cordelia's bouquet. The young woman had become like a daughter to her over the past weeks, stopping by the store daily to help with the overflow of business that had come with Cedar Falls' renewed prosperity. "I look old," Cordelia replied, but without the bitterness that would have colored those words 2 months ago. Now she spoke with the acceptance of a woman who'd learned that beauty came in many forms, and that love could bloom at any season of life. "You look happy," Jenny corrected firmly, "and that's the most beautiful thing any woman can wear on her wedding day." Through the church's windows, Cordelia could see more snow beginning to fall, adding to the magic of the evening. The service had been planned for Christmas Eve at her request. She'd wanted their marriage to be part of the town's celebration, not a separate event that might make people feel obligated to choose between festivities. Mrs. Patterson appeared, at her elbow, dressed in her finest black dress, with a cameo brooch at her throat. The boarding house keeper had become an unexpected ally and friend, her gruff exterior hiding a heart that had room for strays and second chances. "Ready?" the older woman asked. Cordelia took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of pine boughs and candle wax that filled the small church. "As ready as a woman can be to start over at 65. 65 ain't old," Mrs. Patterson declared. "It's experienced, and Marcus is getting himself a woman who knows the value of what she's found." The church's single bell began to toll, its bronze voice carrying across the snow-covered town. As if summoned by the sound, Doc Green appeared to escort her down the aisle. The elderly physician had insisted on the honor, claiming that since he'd been the first to recognize that there was more to her than met the eye, he deserved the privilege of giving her away. "Shall we, my dear?" he asked, offering his arm with old-fashioned gallantry. As they began the slow walk down the aisle, Cordelia felt time stretch and compress around her. Every face in the packed pews held memories. Samuel Brennan, who'd surprised everyone by offering to provide music for the reception. The Kawamoto family, who'd brought lanterns from their farm to add to the evening's glow. Tom Henderson, whose wife had sewn the dress Cordelia wore. Dozens of others who'd become not just neighbors but family. And at the front of the church, waiting with patient love in his eyes, stood Marcus Patterson. He wore his best suit, the one he'd been married in before, but his face held none of the shadows that had haunted him for years. Instead, he looked like a man who'd been given an unexpected gift and intended to treasure it properly. Reverend Walsh, who'd arrived from the county seat specifically for the ceremony, smiled as Doc Green placed Cordelia's hand in Marcus's. The minister was young enough to be her grandson, but his eyes held the wisdom that came from witnessing love in all its forms. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed church, "we are gathered here on this holy evening to witness the union of Marcus Patterson and Cordelia Whitmore in the bonds of matrimony." The familiar words washed over Cordelia, but she barely heard them. Her attention was focused entirely on Marcus's face, on the way he was looking at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. When had anyone last looked at her that way? When had she last felt so completely seen and valued? "Marcus," Reverend Walsh continued, "do you take Cordelia to be your lawful wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" "I do," Marcus replied, his voice steady and sure. "With all my heart I do. And Cordelia, do you take Marcus to be your lawful wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" The words that had seemed impossible just months ago now felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I do," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the church. "With all my heart I do." The ring Marcus slipped onto her finger was simple gold, worn smooth with age. His grandmother's ring, he'd told her, saved all these years for the right woman. As it settled into place, Cordelia felt something inside her chest unlock. A door, opening to possibilities she'd thought were lost forever. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado," Reverend Walsh declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Marcus, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, reverent, full of promise rather than passion. But in that brief contact, Cordelia felt the last of her walls crumble. She was no longer the rejected mail-order bride who'd stepped off the train 2 months ago. She was Mrs. Marcus Patterson, beloved wife and respected member of the Cedar Falls community. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors, the church erupted in celebration. Someone, she thought it might have been Jake Morrison, let out a whoop that would have done justice to a cattle drive. Children threw handfuls of rose petals saved from the summer garden, and the whole congregation began singing "Joy to the World" with such enthusiasm that the windows rattled. The reception that followed was held in Patterson's general store, transformed for the evening with evergreen boughs and strings of paper stars cut by the school children. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every family in town, and someone had produced a fiddle that filled the air with music for dancing. "How does it feel, Mrs. Patterson?" Marcus asked during a brief lull in the festivities, using her new name with obvious pleasure. "Strange," Cordelia admitted, watching their friends and neighbors celebrate around them. "Wonderful, but strange. 2 months ago, I thought my life was essentially over. Now, he prompted gently, now I feel like it's just beginning." She turned in his arms, seeing her reflection in his eyes and liking what she saw there. Not an old woman who'd been lucky to find any husband, but a beloved wife who'd found her perfect match. As the evening wore on and the celebration showed no signs of slowing, Cordelia found herself standing at the store window, looking out at the snow-covered street that had become her world. The same view that had seemed so foreign and unwelcoming on her first day now felt like home in every way that mattered. "Regrets?" Marcus asked, joining her at the window. "Only one," she replied, leaning into his warmth. "What's that?" Cordelia smiled, thinking of the journey that had brought her here, the rejection, the fear, the desperate gamble that had saved a town and found her a love she'd never expected. "I regret," she said softly, "that it took me 65 years to discover that sometimes the best adventures begin when you think you're too old for adventures." Marcus's laughter was warm against her ear. "In that case, Mrs. Patterson, I'd say we're just getting started." Outside, the snow continued to fall on Cedar Falls, covering the rough edges and making everything clean and new. And inside Patterson's general store, surrounded by the laughter and love of the community they'd helped save, Cordelia Whitmore Patterson finally understood that some stories don't end with "happily ever after." They begin with it. The mail order. Bride, who'd been rejected for being too old, had found something infinitely more valuable than a husband. She'd found a home, a purpose, and the rarest gift of all, a second chance at the kind of love that makes every day feel like a new beginning. 2. More great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.